retired professor of sociology at the University of Oregon. We were asked to say something about when did we first become opposed to the war. I can't remember not being opposed to the war. I won't go into all the reasons to be opposed to it. I suspect we all share those. We could go on at length about that. I engaged in all kinds of activities in opposition, one of which was electoral politics. Not very successfully, though. I first helped elect LBJ in 1964 on the premises that Goldwater might win and escalate the war in Vietnam and possibly drop nuclear bombs. Of course, right after he was elected, he did in fact, LBJ was elected, he did in fact escalate the war and the troop levels dramatically. I then in 1972 was a treasurer for the Lane County McGovern campaign, which was an exciting, but of course quite futile effort. Again, when I got to Eugene, Carol and I got here in fall of 1968, a remarkably eventful year, of course. We engaged in all kinds of things. Of course, marches. We even took our small children on those. Teach-ins at the university. I engaged in leafleting and seeing one other person here. I remember being arrested with him and others for having leafleted at Valley River Center, at which time it was not yet illegal to leaflet at Valley River. Later it became illegal to leaflet there. I don't know what was the most productive activities at that time. The most counterproductive, I'm absolutely convinced, were the acts of violence, and Eugene was full of them. We had bombings on campus. PLC, the largest faculty office building, was badly damaged with a bomb in the women's room in the basement. There was a small bomb at Johnson Hall. Many of you may have forgotten that. It didn't do a lot of damage, but there was one. That's when Central Administration was there, but I think also the Chancellor's office was there at that time. There's bombings at banks in Eugene. ROTC was burned. I think all those acts scared the populace, antagonized them. It just worked in the opposite direction of what we were trying to accomplish. One early morning, Steve may talk about this, Steve Deutsch got a call from President Clark of the university to come down to the student union to try to convince students not to engage in violence. So he and I at 3 a.m. went down to try to convince the students not to do that. You might have thought we were successful since there wasn't any violence that night, but I don't know that we had any effect whatsoever. All I remember clearest is a student yelling in my ear, "Are you with us or against us?" and doing it all night long. One of the things that was happening across the campus, across the country, was efforts by students to democratize the university and democratize course offerings, and that usually led to student-taught courses. I sponsored one of those on the University of Oregon campus in fall of 1970. It was called Critical Spirit. It looked at theorists, radical theorists like Marx and successors. And in the fall of that year, the FBI came to the Department Head of Sociology and asked for the class list from that because they knew the name of a person who was in the class who did the bombing. They never said which of the bombings. The department head said, "No, I'm not going to give you the class list." He had called Central Administration. They said, "No, that's against policy." And further, why would you learn anything from a class list if you know the name of this person? After having been rejected there, they then went to Central Administration, who instead didn't ask how would this help. They got a news story from the FBI, which said it was an anonymous call. Somebody in that class knows who did the bombing. They, at that point, the president of the university, Clark, turned that class list over to the FBI. In January, early January, I and the department head wrote to the president, and then I leaked the whole story to the press. The president at that time claimed he'd gotten legal advice from his legal advisor about turning it over to the FBI. The legal advisor there is a name you all know, Dave Fronmeyer. I was furious at him that he would give that advice, so I told him I knew him. And Dave said, "No, I never gave that advice. I only let him say that I had given him that advice." It was a black mark on President Clark. And it's unfortunate because he'd done a lot of wonderful things, including defending John Freund, who was an assistant professor of chemistry, and he became Chicago 6, or Chicago 7, depending on how you're counting, member. And Clark told me many, many years later that he had been fired by the board of the State System of Higher Education. In one meeting, the decision was tabled. The following month, they reversed that decision. So it was a terrible moment at the university. It was one of the most painful things I had ever experienced. What did I learn from all this? Well, I've become pretty radical on all lots of questions, which we can talk about later. Enough speech.
And I'm here because I came through the side door. I didn't come. Well, I came because I married Ken Violent. And I was like 18 years old and I was pregnant, and we were living at his parents' house. And he was going to the University of Oregon, and he would come home and we were eating the food that Chet worked for and arguing over it was like being in the bunker residence, you know. A little nerve-wracking, you know, and Chet would go, "So what are they teaching you at that university? How to be a communist?" And so it was kind of a intense time for the family, and my parents also were not in favor. They thought it was all horrible. So basically, he started getting involved in the Citizens for a Sane Foreign Policy and doing all these different things. He was really, really into it. And his whole line was, well, if you want to help, you can watch the kids, because we're going to do the important stuff, which was Marion and so that was my role, was to take care of the kids while the other, until Marion called me one day and said, what's going on here? And I said, well, you know, so, you know, and he wasn't a chauvinist. I mean, you know, we could never call Ken a chauvinist for that kind of an attitude. So, but through all this, I did get involved, and I got involved in the women's movement and ended up with lifelong friends like Ellen and Jack Maddox and Marion and Stephan, and just a mirage of people that have supported us over the years, and we need a lot of support. So anyway, it was a matter of, back then, we'd have these meetings, mimeograph flyers, stuffing envelopes, licking stamps, and doing the mailings. You had to lick the stamps back then. And I want to honor Dorothy Leeper and Margaret Runkle and Catherine Lawrence, and I can't remember anyway, Dorothy Leeper ran for Congress against John Dellenbach. And Bob Leeper, her husband, stood on the corner of Agate and Franklin with a sign in his sweet little overcoat and his hat that said, "Take my wife, please." It got on the news. It was a big deal. You know, I loved it. And then all the fundraisers they'd have at their house, and they'd cook the salmon, and people would stand in the line going out that driveway where they lived on Agate Street. It would just be this long thing, you know. Anyway, that's my involvement, you know. Good. Okay, thank you.
Well, my name's Ron Egas. I was editor of the Oregon Daily Emerald in 1968-69 and student body president in 1970-71. I think it's good to start out with a couple perspectives in talking about everything that happened. One is that the anti-war movement was not a monolithic movement. There were a lot of different organizations, a lot of different factions. There were community activists, there were campus activists, sometimes in sync, sometimes not. A lot of times, a lot of big arguments over strategies, tactics, and results. The other thing is that it wasn't just an anti-war movement, and that was alluded to before. There was a lot going on. There was a civil rights movement, there was the war on poverty, there was a student rights movement, and it all kind of came together in a period of time. It was a period of change, and it was a period of change in which being an activist in and of itself made you a radical. I didn't start the University of Oregon to be a radical. I started the University of Oregon to be a sports reporter. And I worked for the Oregon Daily Herald as a sports reporter, moved to news, into the editorial page, and then eventually became editor. And then in 1968, in the summer, I'm working on the Omaha World Herald in an internship, watching the Democratic National Convention and the Prague Spring, I think. And when I came back to campus, after the convention, the attitude in campus had definitely changed. The atmosphere had definitely changed. There's a lot of activity, but this was face-to-face activity, and sometimes in-your-face activity, and a lot of organizing and a lot of tension. It was also when Martin Luther King and Robert Kennedy, had been shot before. But still, I'm chronicling this, working for the Oregon Daily Herald. I'm not an activist. I'm not a participant. In fact, my first overt activity was a sit-in, sleep-in actually, in the porch of Johnson Hall, a group of students demonstrating to get a student's participation in the selection of a new president. Later that summer, it turned out that Charles Johnson, under a lot of pressure from the board and everything happening on campus, ended up being killed in an auto accident. And it sort of, said it might be a little time to take some pressure off, but there was no time to take the pressure off. I still hadn't finished school, so I went from being from the Emerald to being an assistant with Kip Morgan in his student body presidency. And then Kent State in Cambodia happened. And I decided to run for student body president, teaming up with another assistant, Mike Commit. Kind of the irony here is that we decided we didn't want to run against each other, so we decided who was going to be student body president by a flip of the coin. But it was an intense time and one of the most contested elections and one of the highest turnouts. But I got elected in the middle of the student strike after we had taken over the student union. Took over 13th, closed 13th Street, which was planned over a few beers at Maxie's Tavern to try and keep the momentum going. I remember a lot of other things in that year. I remember the bombing at PLC, and I actually got called to the FBI office. They had an anonymous letter that said I knew something. I told them I didn't, and if I did, I'd tell them, but that they ought to consider there might have easily been some right-wing fanatics as opposed to anti-war protesters that did the bomb. During the summer before, I had been part of the National Student Association, and we voted to send a delegation of students to South Vietnam to meet with South Vietnamese students. Sometime in November, John Freunds comes into my office and says, "Do you want to go to North Vietnam?" So I participated in a trip to North Vietnam because the South Vietnamese wouldn't let us into South Vietnam. The end result of that, though, was the People's Peace Treaty, which we brought back and was used as an organizing tool. I remember at one point, I think we were organizing a march down to the city council to support them voting for it. And we were told, or I was told, that we should not go ahead with the march, that we would be arrested because there had been other demonstrations that had created confrontations with police. We went ahead anyway, and we had a very peaceful march down to the city council, and I believe they eventually did pass that resolution. I recall the Student Faculty Coalition, another tactic, another strategy, and giving me 50,000 signed petitions that I could give to we gave to Senator Mark Hatfield in a big rally. And I look back on those times, and I've tried at times to try and explain it to people, and it's really hard. I remember going to a class of the son of a friend of mine years later to talk about Vietnam. And all I could do is say, I look at one student and I said, all right, imagine that you get to go to college. Imagine that your best friend doesn't and gets drafted. Imagine, if you're a woman, that your brother is on the verge of getting drafted. Imagine that your parents might disown you because you oppose the war. Imagine that you've learned that the government has lied to you. imagine that you were seeing pictures of the war and you were seeing people who have been napalmed. And that you've seen people, the result of cluster bombs. And imagine what it would be like if you were called a traitor. Now imagine veterans coming back from that war, and all of a sudden, when you're told you're unpatriotic, you got veterans saying, "I'm against the war." And I don't think the movement really took off. I think we had more losses than victories. What we did was mobilize people and change opinions. And I think one of the biggest things that happened was when the veterans came back and said, we're against the war too. The other thing that I want to add is that a really important thing was the interfaith council and the interfaith efforts that went on. Because this meant that this was a moral issue. So when you had the veterans and you had the religious faiths saying this war is wrong, that gave you the kinds of things you needed to continue the organizing and continue the movement.
Oregon, David Wyther, and certainly didn't expect to get involved in the anti-war movement. My father was a disabled veteran, and I wanted to be a Green Beret until Kennedy got killed. Came to the University of Oregon with goals of making the Olympic team and getting a PhD in either economics or history. But along the way, I came to the conclusion that the war was a very, very bad idea, and the only way to stop the war was to end the draft. So, and I'm going to use the word "I" a bunch of times, but it's actually a fairly good-sized group of which were somewhat interchangeable sometimes. So the first thing I did was file a conscientious objector claim, and then I refused my student deferment. And during this period of time, it went very quickly, and there was only a few classes that had to go through what Ron and I had to go through, which was class of 65 out of high school, where in 66 they gave us all a test. Those who got less than a 70 got drafted. Then it was grades, then it was end of graduate student deferments. Each year, eventually they went to a lottery, which is a little more equitable, but there were still many ways out of the draft. Then I helped form a draft information center to provide the rules and regs to students so that they could avoid the draft using various bureaucratic trickery, I guess you could call it. Clinton is a perfect example of somebody who did it right. It turned politically, as it turns out. So along the way, a lot of things happened. I was involved in a set-in at the draft board in 1967 after picketing. Out of that, all of us got arrested, and we sort of, that group became some of the leaders of the anti-war and anti-draft movement. Kip Morgan joined our anti-draft group. The first thing that we did of any scale in Eugene was we hung a 28-foot long, 6-foot high sign that said Vietnam in red letters on Christmas Eve of 1967 from the cross. Unfortunately, got smashed down by the police, and so nobody ever saw it. And but the idea was when people got up for Christmas, they'd see Vietnam in these big red letters. So each way along the way, things would escalate in terms of what we were doing and in terms of what the war was doing. In the summer of '68, for example, my friends and I were on the front lines of the Chicago demonstrations. And Ron was absolutely right. It changed, the whole tone changed after the police riot that we went through. Refused induction in 1968 in October with a group, and we chained ourselves to the front of the draft bus. Kip took one wheel, I took the other, and then a woman named Marla Vanderwater was our spokesperson and did that sort of thing. Of course, the draft, they switched buses on us. We had 500 people at the Greyhound Depot, and we did what we did in front of the draft station. After that, we came up with the idea of arresting our draft boards for attempting to force us to commit war crimes. I know it's a stretch, but we couldn't get arrested. We kept trying. And so, I didn't get arrested for refusing induction. I had too good a CO claim. Anyway, so, Kip wrote up the indictment. I have a 20-page brochure that became a collage at that tofu and tie-dye thing that they had at the fairgrounds. Yeah, I got a lot of wall space out of this thing that I came up with in about a week, way back in '69. Anyway, so Kip wrote up an indictment. I organized the court. We went to Roseburg, Oregon, walked in and said they were under arrest. Kip started reading the indictment. My friend Blaine started discussing possible defenses. I brought the jury in. A policeman showed up, so we never got a chance to finish the indictment, because I made a deal. We made our point. You know, they were just doing their jobs. That was so much fun. We did the Eugene draft board the next week. In the middle of that, the fellow who had, as it turns out, had stopped me from getting my conscientious objector rating, got up from the table and physically attacked Kip. Turned red. He was about 70 years old at the time. I was afraid he was going to have a heart attack, and so I adjourned at that point. The closest we came to an actual trial was a week later. The Navy recruiters, and we found him not guilty by reason of insanity. But out of all of that, we finally got arrested. There was a group that was sort of known as the Eugene 7. And Kip and I were kind of the leaders of it. And then while we were out on bail, we elected him student body president. I'm sure he has the NCAA record for being out on bail for 7 felonies. Many of them not very nice. I don't have time to go into all the details. While we were being arraigned, the federal judge, Solomon, ironically, flipped out on me. I did a 10-day fast, got the judges changed. That judge threw the case out. That judge got appointed to the Ninth Circuit, so we got the 3rd judge. There were only 3 of them. And he turned out to be a good trial judge. While I was fasting, I came up with the idea of Kubduga Bookstore. I don't know how many people remember that store. The book spelled backwards. And that sort of kept me out of trouble for the summer at least. And then my brother, while he was buying books in San Francisco, got the original Rolling Stone distribution for the United States for bookstores. So at one point we had 400 accounts across the country. I was still out on bail. You normally don't start a business when you're out of bail, from what I've been told. But we were so young, we didn't know any better. And then eventually I had to go serve my time. And we were supposed to go over to the coast and plant trees. The guy in charge of that didn't like our file, so I went to Lompoc Federal Correctional. We were supposed to be there 18 months, which would have got me back in time to file for city council, which is something I intended to do. But Lieutenant Calley got convicted of war crimes, so our case had some sort of validity to it, and we got out early. In the process of trying to convince a judge to let us out early, my cousin, who had been drafted because he took a health class and dropped him from 12 credit hours to 11, who got shot in Vietnam because he took a health class, unfortunately, stormed into the judge's office and yelled at the federal judge. You'd be surprised how much time you get now for doing it. But he got away with it. And so it was just a whole different era. It's kind of really hard to explain. And so many different things were going on simultaneously, and so many people were involved, either part-time or full-time or more than full-time. And I did run for city council, and at the end of the campaign, Ed Fadley was able to get my conviction set aside. So I thought I was home free at that point. Turns out the FBI didn't take it off my record. I got fired a whole series of times for 20 years, until finally somebody showed me my rap sheet. And I got the paperwork together. I talked to Sid Lezak, the former U.S. attorney, who was a friend of mine, who was the prosecutor. He said, just take it to the FBI. So I go to the FBI with my paperwork. And the agent says, oh, I've been waiting 20 years to do something like this. Sure, I'll take care of it. Well, thank you for the last 20 years. And so those are some of my experiences. And hopefully I did this in 5 minutes. That sounds about right.
In high school, there were a group of us that were organized informally against Vietnam and the Vietnamese War, And we were incensed by the fact that we had to go to a organized program by the military recruiters. And they were invited into the high school, we all had to go, and they told us our duty to our country under the Selective Service Law. And I remember 4 of us, I think Ann Tattersall, Phil Atney, Ben Agger, and myself went to the principal and said, "You're not explaining one part of the law. You can't do that. You can explain, if you're gonna explain our duty to military service, you have to explain the non-military alternative." And his answer, I remember very clearly, he said, "Not in my school." And so we went to Joe Richards, who was a prominent lawyer in town, and Joe drafted a letter for us, sent it to the superintendent of schools, Millard Pond, and said that unless this changes, we're gonna sue. And the end result was very quickly a letter from Millard Pond saying there'll be no military recruiters in the high schools from here on. Yeah. So that was one of the few successes. When I did turn 18, or as I did, I applied for CO status, and I got the status, which was quite surprising since no one else got it, including a lot of other very qualified people. So, and I would really credit the letter from Lou Nyman for that, and also the track record I had of pacifism going back several years. And I did get involved in an organization, maybe some of you have heard of it. I think it was called CCCO, Committee for Conscientious Objectors. And the purpose of that was to promote education about non-military option, and then sitting down with people that wanted to apply to be conscientious objectors and to help them with their case. So we did that for several years, and quite a few of these people we were dealing with were people that had just got the word they're going to be drafted. And it was kind of too late for them because at that moment their chances weren't good, but we tried. Another thing I got involved with was an organization that tried to keep demonstrations and peace rallies from going violent. And I think what provoked this, or what prompted this, was the burning of the ROTC building. When we realized, as a group of us, that we're hoping for a peace rally, all of a sudden this was getting violent, and there were people, we started to realize that there were agents provocateurs that were trying to push this into a violent demonstration that it wasn't intended on being. And we started realizing who they were. And so we started an organization, and we actually had some training on how to turn a potentially nonviolent, how to keep a violent demonstration or a nonviolent demonstration from becoming violent. So there's one more thing I'll talk about, and then I'll end. And that was an outreach program. This is when I was a student. This is when Ron Ekus was president of the student body. And it was a group of us that were going out into the community to try to explain our anti-war message to community groups. And these were informal groups of a dozen people perhaps in someone's living room, and we would go and try to convince them that this war was a mistake for us, and so forth and so on. And I would say exactly what Ron said, and that was that as a conscientious objector and as peace activists, we were not very effective at this. I mean, we could talk until we're blue in the face, but we weren't effective until we started combining with veterans from the war. And when we had returning veterans and we went into people's houses, that really made a difference. That's when it really became effective. And I can remember 2 in particular. One was a kid that was in high school with me, and I don't know if we should be mentioning names, probably not. I think I'll leave his name off. I remember him saying at age 17 he couldn't wait to join the Army and shoot gooks. And he went to Vietnam, he had disillusioned, came back, and he was one of our very best people. Because he could go into these living rooms and he could say, you could say how bad the war was and how bad what we were doing was, in a way that people could understand. And a second one was a sergeant who had been in Vietnam, and he was a black Jew from Trinidad, I remember that part, and he was spellbinding also. He was so convincing. So that's the piece I wanted to mention.
My name is Carol Van Houten. Some of the things Don's already referenced. Sort of my first political involvement was canvassing for Johnson in 1964 when I was very pregnant. But it seemed really important to do because it sure looked like gold. Like otherwise we were going to be into a hot war in a hot minute. So of course we all know what happened down the road. So that was a very disillusioning moment for me. Then in 1968, early 1968, Don got hired at the University of Oregon, and we were leaving Indiana and getting ready to move here. As Ben mentioned, 1968 was a very eventful year in April with Martin Luther King being killed, and then the day we sold our house in Indiana to get ready to move here was to a family that we liked very much and we connected with, was the day that Bobby Kennedy was shot. So that was that kind of hello. And then we were driving across country with our 3 little children during the police riot, during the convention in Chicago. Kind of in touch with what was going on and only getting bits of it, but getting the idea of just how horrible this was. So we got here. In Indiana, it hadn't been very politically active, so I wasn't particularly doing anything, but I got here and I don't remember who I met first, but it was probably Marion. And with our preschool kids, it seems like several times a week there was something that we were involved with doing and planning besides the various marches that usually came from the campus. We took our preschool children with us on many of these things. And one of the funny things that happened is that they kind of learned that if they didn't want to do what their dad and I wanted to do, they could sit in the back seat and say, no more, whatever. That was also a time when, of course, the war was on TV, on the regular news, because the reporters had access to what was really happening. So one of the things I wanted to share has to do with the personal thing for me. I remember very clearly driving a car on 24th Street right by then Roosevelt, then junior high, with one of my sons in the car, in the front seat, of course, back then. And he looked up at me and said, when I grow up, will I have to go to war? And that really crystallized something for me about my personal commitment. I had all these intellectual ideas, and I was very much against the war, and the various mottos out there. If you're not part of the solution, you're the problem. If you're, but for me, that really, it really deepened it. That it was my job to do what I could to change things. I share with what some people have said that it's hard to know whether we were successful or not. I think I have to credit Marianne for always saying it's really important to keep doing what you can do. So that's what I've tried to do.
Hi, my name is Dennis Gilbert, and in the whole spectrum of folks, I probably earned something of a reputation of being a hardcore leftist. And so let me just begin by sharing my chance to engage in violent acts. And one night I got a call, and somebody offered that I could go to a mailbox and pick up a lot of dynamite, and they hoped that I would blow up the cross. And frankly, I thought it was the FBI, who had regularly called my wife over the years to try to get her to testify against her parents, which was sort of a non-issue. It was just harassment. So all of these things are pretty complicated. I just thought I'd say that. I, like a lot of other people, came to Eugene in 1968 to attend graduate school in physics at the U of O. Before that time, my then wife and I went to Fresno State, and we were leaders in a Friends of SNCC group with the goals of desegregating schools in a very segregated place, which Fresno was, and also organizing farm workers in the middle of the San Joaquin Valley with the then Farm Worker Organizing Committee, the precursor to the United Farm Workers, in some very successful consumer boycotts at the time. As we were leaving, an SDS chapter was forming with an anti-imperialist kind of outlook on the war in Vietnam. But I was accepted at UCSB in Santa Barbara, and I stayed there for about a year, but frankly, my heart was in political activism, and the physics department there recognized it, and so I searched for another thing to do, and I ended up applying to U of O with the thought that I would both be a serious activist and a serious physics student, both, and get through school, and then allow my wife, who was also a leader in her own right and a person of color, to have her shot at school, which she eventually did. So when we came here, that was a year when the country really did change, as other people were saying. It was just remarkable. At Santa Barbara, this is one of the many things I was going to leave out, but Wayne Morris spoke at UCSB, and the reception was just wild, and it was deep, and Morris, you could see, oh, I can't believe it. Okay, he was taken back by it. He was shocked. He could see, he was in this uphill fight, and all of a sudden, that's what it was. I'll tell you how I got involved, which I think is really important. When I came here, I saw the anti-draft work, I saw just anti-war activism, and I also saw these student anti-war activists connected with the labor movement in really amazing ways. And I attended one big rally, and Ken Byland was there, right?
Doesn't surprise me.
The president of, he was the president of the Labor Council at the time, and he gave this roaring speech, really a union organizing speech, saying, you students, you need to organize a union to stop the war. And that's the call that I took up, and built my activity around that. And that activity was pushed the boundaries of thinking. We said, look, students, we shouldn't just be opposed to the policy and uniting with people that oppose the policy. We should be in solidarity with people who were opposing the implementation of that policy, and that meant solidarity with the people in Vietnam fighting against US forces. And we organized around that, and in my little bit of time, I should mention a variety of things, but much creativity involved. And there was a women's sewing circle that was developed, in which there was feminist consciousness raising, and also National Liberation Front flags were produced. And I brought one there. Maybe somebody could bring it over here. And so people, so in the very colorful demonstrations, these kind of things were quite often, of course, an act of treason, in many people's eyes, but also sort of eye-opening and very well made if you, if you know.
Durable.
And as I think Ron said something about this, there were really varieties of directions to the movement, and some people were confined just on campus, some people were defined off campus, alienated from the campus, and then other people spanned the two, and that's the group that I was in. Eugene had this reputation of being the Berkeley of the Northwest, but we played a different role than Berkeley did, because as soon as people got active here, the reigning radical dogma was that you needed to go to the big cities, and so activists would be sort of built here, and they would go to Seattle, or most likely San Francisco, Oakland, or LA, or San Diego, or sometimes Chicago and New York. So it was actually the rare person with an activist background who came to Eugene to live at that time. Oh, you know, like, what a pleasure, because we lose so many people. And then finally, let me just say one more thing. The starting of the labor movement and the involvement, like Ken, what did this come out of? I think something for the record. There was quite a wise leader in the labor movement here, and I'll leave out the name. But he was putting out a newsletter, an anti-war newsletter, and basically, given the spirit of the times, the Building Trades Council, of which he was a part of, from Portland, came down and told him, we're going to kill you if you don't stop that. It was just like that. That was a reflection of the raw, what was going on in this country, and I don't think we should be really ignoring that. You know, people were assassinated. You know, Fred Hampton and Mark Clark and a number of people like that. And I guess maybe I'll save my other comments for later. Thank you.
My name is Rachel Jordan, and we were only in Eugene from 1970 to 72. So my anti-war opposition started a lot before that and continued afterwards. I came by, and honestly, my father voted for Norman Thomas at least 4 times. And his sister, my aunt, had her wages garnished because she protested during World War II, which was very rare, and marched in the first scene marches in Cleveland. But we came from Berkeley, where we had participated in rallies and some really big marches through San Francisco to protest the war. We came here, my husband was working on his doctorate at the U of O, and I was home with 3 small children, taking care of my children. Somewhere along the line, I met Marion, who got me away from my home. And through her, I became involved with the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, which was a real important group in Eugene at that time in the anti-war movement. We held at least weekly vigils downtown and some marches through downtown Eugene. And I almost always took my children. I called my daughter, my oldest daughter. I thought she might remember something. She said, I remember being in a plaza and handing out flyers. She said it was really fun, but I had no idea what I was doing. But they caught on eventually. There was one traveling exhibit we set up that really moved me, and it was paintings by children from Laos, and it was paintings of their view of the world. They were living in caves to protect them from US bombing, and their view of the world was a sky full of planes and bombs. And I remember being angry because so many people passed by and didn't even bother to look at it. And I wanted to say, pay attention. This is important. it was very important to me to have an outlet to express my opposition to the war, and through Marion and the Women's International League, I could do that, and I don't know how effective we were, but I still feel it was important. And it was very satisfying being with a group of dedicated people every week, always doing something. I did compose a few letters to the editor, but I don't think any of them were published. Then I contacted my congressmen and other officials, which I continue to do. Who knows if that does any good. My feelings about the war at that time were based on the evil I saw my country doing to a small country that was trying to shake off all traces of colonialism, and had been for years, and destroying the environment with toxic chemicals and murdering people with horrible methods. That was my main involvement. I wasn't at that time too concerned about our soldiers. I knew they were young and mainly uneducated, but they could be taught to follow orders and to kill. And I didn't have a whole lot of sympathy for them. But years later, I worked in a VA hospital for 10 years in alcohol and drug program and PTSD programs. We had mostly Vietnam vets. We had some from Korea and a few even from World War II. And I became very much more in depth aware of the consequences of war on the people that are in the front lines and actually do the fighting, and what it does to them. And I could talk about that all day, but that was at a later time. So I think that's all I have.
All right, this read out at 5 minutes at home. Let's see what it does now. Okay. I'm Bill Cadbury, Professor Emeritus of English at the University of Oregon, where I went to work in 1961 and retired in 1992. I was here then for the whole of the war, except that in 1965 to 6, I was at Fisk University in Nashville. And in 1968-9, I had a fellowship in linguistics at MIT, where I could observe and learn from Noam Chomsky's never slacking off on his teaching and research, while at the same time being among the leaders of the Boston area anti-war movement. Many academics in those years lost that balance and surely have to be counted as casualties of the war. I take the project here to be to see if after all this time the meaning of the various turbulent events has snapped into focus. But I must say that the events themselves glimmer out only fitfully from the fog of war. There is a clear contrast with the opening state when I got here, 1961, you see, which is somewhat earlier than the years that people have been talking about so far. The UO at that time was a party school of 6,000 students, politically deeply conservative. Activism amounted to, one, Vic Saban's admirable but quixotic one-man campaign to save the college side inn, if anybody remembers that. Two, the antiphonal reading of Ginsberg's Howl to protest his free speech-related firing. Some of us were involved in that. Three, Arthur Fleming's permitting Gus Hall to come and be laughed at Hayward Field. And four, some small but intense protests against housing discrimination against blacks, honchoed by CORE. Honor, if memory serves, goes to Clyde DeBerry and Jim Knoski, as I remember for that. Of course, we all were thinking about race in those years, more on a national than a local level. That's why I went to Fisk, there at the tail end of the first phase of the civil rights struggle. Johnson signed the Voting Rights Act as I arrived in Nashville. James Meredith was marching across Mississippi as I drove back in 1966. In Nashville, we did various protest marches on the civil rights front, but I remember taking a substantial group of Fisk students to a teach-in against the war at Vanderbilt, though I didn't have the maturity or organizational skills to follow up, and that was the only time I remember Fisk-Vanderbilt interaction, if a block of black faces in a sea of white could be called interaction. But it felt to me back in Eugene, and feels now looking back on it, as if everything changed in that year. Of course, for me, with a new African-American wife, race continued to be a main concern, as it was in Eugene as a whole. This, after all, is the time of the Black Panthers. But in some ways, the war in Vietnam underlay it and everything else. University governance, curricular reform, sex, drugs, rock and roll. There is something holistic, although also pathetic, about my film students and I doing some kind of guerrilla theater routine outside PLC in response to the shootings at Kent State and Jackson State. We brandished our copies and quoted from Mao's Little Red Book as we had learned to do from Godard's La Chinoise, which we completely misunderstood. A scene which would have been completely inconceivable in 1962. I was not a honcho of the Eugene anti-war movement per se, in the way I was a honcho of the sanctuary movement 15 years later. But here again, there's linkage. When I returned to Religion and Friends meeting and the project of Sanctuary beckoned, where Karen Hemmingson and I only naturally turned was to Marion, Malcolm, and CALC, which for me, no matter what the name changes are, will always be clergy and laity concerned about the war in Vietnam, which is not the original title, I know, quite. The organizational skills to build an interfaith coalition with national and international connections were there waiting at CALC, which would not have been the case without the war in Vietnam. In the best possible way, for once we can say what goes around comes around. It's amazing how unrecoverable specific moments of anti-war action are for me. Doing a presentation at some church, though I was no expert, a good number of marches downtown carrying signs and chanting, more teach-ins and the like at the Herb, of which I was observer, not presenter. The most memorable scene that comes to the surface was in that court at one of the moratorium days. I picture it with candles, though maybe not. Someone slowly read the list of UO students killed in Vietnam, and for each name, those who had known the person were to rise and remain standing. By the end of the list, an astounding number of people were standing there, and it brought home to me, like nothing else, the personal cost of the war. Though even here, a certain irony intrudes. We were not at that point reading the names of Vietnamese dead. A general lesson, General Washington said that men act from their interests and their passions, and I think both have to be involved for a mass movement like the anti-war movement, or the American Revolution, to succeed. If not for the draft and for the quite real prospect of being sent off against one's will to die in Vietnam, the passions of the nation, especially of its youth, would not have been engaged. And you can't do it again unless everyone, or huge numbers at least, feel their own ox to be seriously gored. The passions of the virtuous are mighty, maybe even necessary, but insufficient. For climate change, for somewhat limited wars of aggression in countries far away, for the unattractive dominance of gated communities, such as the one our own district attorney lives in, and the other antics of the 1%, for the revelation of the police as an occupying power in the lives of the 10% who are of color, not a chance. The mighty are clever and will prevail. I no longer take solace in Che Guevara's saying, struggle and defeat, struggle and defeat, struggle and defeat, on to victory. Sorry to be negative, but somebody's got to be sometime.
Deutsch. I'm retired from the University of Oregon. My background was different from most people in this room. I grew up as a boy in the Religious Society of Friends, Quakers, as a conscientious objector. My case came up during the Korean War. In 1964, my young family and I were living in Cleveland, Ohio. And our first protest against the Vietnam War was with my faculty colleague, famous baby doctor Benjamin Spock. And in the spring of 1964, there were very few pieces of information about Vietnam out there. But there were people in the Friends meeting, and Ben Spock and a few others, who were better informed and recognizing that things were brewing in a way that was very distressing. And so Beth Deutsch and our two little children, and I'm sorry I lost my wife recently. Forgive me. So we participated in a march into downtown Cleveland, and it was quite well attended. And the majority of the people outside the media really were asking the question, well, what's going on in Vietnam? Why are you marching? What's the protest? What's going on? Most Americans at that time had no concept of what was really going on. There was some American military there. And of course, by August of 1964, that really changed with the Tonkin Bay Resolution and the heroism of Wayne Morris and Ernest Greening, the two United States senators, to oppose that resolution. By the next spring of 1965, I was part of a National Quaker American Friends Service Committee delegation to go to Washington and lobby against the war in Vietnam. And that was the first time I met Wayne Morris personally. And let me tell you, for those of you who never had the pleasure of meeting, he was a powerful dynamo of incredible integrity, incredible intelligence, and blessedly courageous. He stood there and in the spring of 1965 really saying what needed to be said in a unique way. He had liaisons with friends of his in the Pentagon and in the State Department, and then he would come out and hold a press conference and talk about these people who were running a preemptive war against Vietnam to go against China now before it got any stronger. So meeting Wayne Morse for me was incredible. I didn't know where Oregon was, but I was out there. But he was truly inspirational. That was also the time in which I was then clerk of a Quaker meeting, and I joined with clergy in the Cleveland area as part of a national organization called Clergy and the Laity Concerned About Vietnam. And it was a very powerful expression for me of relating to the religious community, not my own, but going out to churches all over Northeast Ohio and speaking about the war in Vietnam. In a very short period of time, unplanned, unexpected totally, I was invited to consider a job at the University of Oregon, and Beth was taken by Eugene, and we moved here with our young children. In August 1966, and the first thing that greeted us as we arrived was Hubert Humphreys speaking at the University of Oregon, and within days of my arrival, I was being recruited to be part of a teach-in speaking against the war in Vietnam, and Hubert Humphrey in particular. I was given the name of 3 clergy in the Eugene community and said, good luck, brother, see if you can get a CALC chapter started in Eugene. And so I did really take that very, very seriously, along with Beth Deutsch, who was all very involved in the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom and other things. And we got a CALC chapter started in Eugene, and it's wonderful that almost a half a century later, CALC, as we know it, still is active. And I honor everybody in this room, and I particularly, I think, honor the younger ones in this room, because you were the ones in a different kind of courage standing up against what was there for Vietnam. I wasn't that much older, but significantly older than those of you who are students, who are putting yourselves in jeopardy in terms of being eligible for the draft and all the things that came of it. And I honor you and I respect you immensely. Arriving here in 1966 was amazing. Charlie Porter was running for Congress. Hatfield was running for the United States Senate. Morris was already in the United States Senate. It felt like I was leaving a right-wing state, Ohio, and moving to a progressive new America. It was blessed. It was wonderful. I think that CALC has been an absolutely incredible organization in the half century since. And I think the thing I'd like to end with is really a comment of enormous respect for everybody in this room. For those who early on in the days in opposition to the Vietnam War understood the travesty that it was. You didn't have to have Morse's intellect to understand the constitutional issues. You didn't have to have the particulars about the geography. But people understood early on in this place, more than most rest of the United States. And I think this is a tradition that we really need to honor, of what was here then and what's continued, and makes this a very special place.
I'm Ellen Maddox. Jack and I came here also in '66. It was then I met Marion, I met Beth, I met a lot of other fabulous women who formed WILF. We came here and did not know if Jack would get his deferral, because he made the mistake of getting his doctorate in 3 years when he was only 25. So it was scary when we came out with the few possessions we had from graduate school, and me pregnant with our first child. But it was also liberating because we left the South, where we were arrested in civil rights demonstrations, where we both had conditional sentences. Jack, being a native Southerner, had a 6-month conditional sentence. I was not a native Southerner. I grew up in Atlanta, where I had been demonstrated the first time, not against segregation then, but it was with people from Martin Luther King's office against the Cuban Missile Crisis. And from there, I went to graduate school where I met Jack in North Carolina. And coming out here was wonderful. It was so liberating politically after being in the South. Jack and I got arrested in that Valley River, picketing the Duns. And, I don't even remember who was babysitting our kids. And Jack and I mean, we were so dumb, didn't think to have bail money with us. But somebody had cash and got us out of there. It was a very intense time, but it was a time when you felt surrounded by people who cared, people who had broader concerns than what I so frequently see today among students, among the general society. Maybe it was coming out of the being involved in civil rights, coming here and immediately being involved in the anti-war movement. I have always said that is what saved me, because I would have been so alone. Jack was on campus. I was a young pregnant woman who knew nobody. But the people I met were probably the finest people I will ever know in my life, particularly Beth Deutsch. But they were all good people, the people we've mentioned, like Dorothy and a lot of other people. Our kids, particularly our son, knew nothing else because the anti-war movement consumed my life. When we were in Washington, D.C. for what was known as the last coming of Richard Nixon, we happened to be nearby in Chapel Hill, so we came up for the counter-inauguration, which was to be the last demonstration against the war. Our son, who was then 6 years old, said, "Mommy, it can't be the last demonstration against the war. There's always been a war in Vietnam." It's all he knew. I came to the vigil 4 days before he was born, and everybody left the vigil and moved us into a rented house from our two books, because it was our society, and we took care of each other.
On the day that we're recording,
Say your name.
I'm Jack Maddox. I'm a retired history professor. I'm with Ellen. On the day that we're recording these, the University of Oregon campus is blanketed with posters for Vietnam Night. The kids, young Vietnamese people who are putting out these posters in the Vietnamese Students Association have chosen as their theme a reminiscent "Once Upon a Time." And from the pictures that are on the posters, it's evident that the time that they think of as formative for their identity is probably sometime during the Lei Dynasty, hundreds of years ago. Comparing and contrasting this with the perspectives that we are bringing to this, where we're looking really at only 50 years or a little less back. Yes, I, like Ellen, came here in 1966, not at all welcoming leaving the South. There are many things I like better about the South. But I had been part of different socialist movements from about 1962 in college, I had the town clerk in Princeton accuse me of inciting to riots simply because of a leaflet we were going to hand out at the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Had been involved in quite a number of radical activities, academic and activist. And one thing about these dates you hear, when we're talking about the anti-war movement in Eugene, it sounds like one blur when you give it all together. Every year was significantly different from the year before it and the year after it, especially on campus, but even off campus. The organizations involved, the kind of activities involved, the kind of community reception, the community spirit. Every single one of those years, you'd have to recognize is different from the other, with the summers, usually even off campus, being where you would make the transition point from one year to another. In 66, 67, a number of really interesting things happened. We did indeed start, and it's only been mentioned when Ellen briefly brought it up, a weekly vigil on Saturday afternoons, I believe, at the park blocks. Saturday morning?
I think so.
Okay. It started out pretty big, but there were some rugged souls who kept, when it got down to half a dozen people, nevertheless kept showing up for, I believe, several years. By then it had been dwarfed by many other activities. The off-campus, well, the faculty-student group with parallel leaderships that was around the year before faded out by the end of that year. Citizens for a Sane Foreign Policy became an off-campus group that staged the march that was in the Emerald issue that is being passed around. And also during that year, Steve Deutsch launched CALC. I'm worried that I may have let Steve down. CalCAV was not one of the things that I was particularly active in, which is ironic since I was a believing Christian and a church member and strongly anti-war.
And your minister was one of those names I was given.
Norm Pott was of value there. I was a religiously motivated activist, but was following a Marxian social science view that led me in political activity not to talk about the religion that I was thinking about all the time. And that is one of the reasons why I've always doubted that historical research will ever quite add up to the total of how heavily the heavy religious motivation was in the movements of the 60s. Already out of time? Okay, I had some stories to tell, but no.
Tell one.
I want to talk about the Valley River 5 again.
Well, Don mentioned it and I alluded to it.
Yeah, it's, that one's been done. In 69, 70, I was pretty heavily called on by the people in SDS, which was then being taken over by the Revolutionary Union, to speak at their rallies because they could count on, I think looking back on it, they could count on me to say things that would always be pointing toward revolutionary overthrow of the existing government. On the other hand, they knew that when I would say things that were trying to distinguish between my politics and theirs, I would be so incomprehensible as to be totally ineffective. It was, and there was an evening that I guess Ron will remember when we actually did get the university closed down after Kent State in 70, which was during Parents' Weekend. And therefore, they turned all the parents' weekend activities student groups did into educational anti-war activities. And Ron and I were in Mac Court speaking along with President Robert Clark to a group of alumni, some of whom were very hostile, especially were very hostile to Ron, it seemed to me. I would like to stop there, yeah.
My name is Debbie Gordon. I do have a father here. I am not Sharon Gordon. Different. I had a Leave It to Beaver childhood with an at-home mom and a daddy doctor, and they were Republicans at the time. But I received here in Eugene a great public education, which included the arts and politics. You know, in every junior high and high school, there was a student government. On the home front, I received a solid grounding in Christian values. Church is what we did together as a family. Oregon celebrated our centennial year in 1959, and I was in the 6th grade. We went to the Oregon Capitol. I was blown away. I was hooked with being an active citizen and an Oregonian. Okay, so I graduated from South Eugene High School in 1965. I was sent to Willamette University to major in music. I knew nothing about the world outside of white, peaceful, privileged, middle-class Eugene. Nothing of the huge social changes unfolding elsewhere. The civil rights movement, the changing social norms and values around women, or the growing oppression of consumerism. Nothing of American foreign policy, the Cuban Missile Crisis, much less a war unfolding across the sea. Nowhere in my world were people talking about these things. Nowhere. A friend of mine had joined the Marines, a little bit older than me, and he was on the front lines in Vietnam, and he was writing me letters every day. He was involved with and witnessing terrible atrocities, and he was describing them to me. There was a huge disconnect between the values I was raised with and naively believed that we practiced as a country and what I learned was happening in the real world. First, there was the spiritual. I had been taught, thou shalt not kill, love one another. I was at a Methodist school. Later, it would become the principles of democracy, like justice for all. Why didn't anyone at this Methodist school want to talk to me about these things? I had a spiritual crisis and decided the church was full of hypocrites, and it would be about 20 years before I would even consider being part of a spiritual community again. I felt lied to and alone, confused and depressed. I flunked out of school and came back to Eugene. My parents didn't know what to do with me. But I was fortunate. They kept the lines of communication open, and they had a teacher at the university who let me read a book called Alienated Youth and write a paper on it. I did that. And I was fortunate because of that opportunity and that privilege. I got to spend the next few years with one foot at the University of Oregon and the other foot in the community as one of those sex, drugs, rock and roll, hippie musicians. So I was in the community, I was singing, I was being a young person, but I wasn't in it just for the party. But I found common cause and community with my musician friends. We started out singing folk music at the Fridays of 4 at the Student Union. And then the older brother of one of our bandmates came up from San Francisco to manage our band. So that brought a lot to us. I think I will never, ever, ever forget the moment that I heard the 7 o'clock news on a scratchy radio in a car. I was riding around with some friends. Do you remember that? Remember that? The 7 o'clock news, Simon and Garfunkel. They're singing Silent Night, and the news starts out soft, and it builds and builds and builds, all these things that are going on. Well, I didn't know about those things. So I got some questions. Who was Lenny Bruce? Who was Martin Luther King? Why was our society so violent and materialistic? Why was our country fighting in Vietnam? Anyway, the guy from San Francisco, he brought up some new music, the Grateful Dead, Country Joe and the Fish, who delivered some really in-your-face messages that we could play for our parents. And I did that. Didn't go over really well. But also our San Francisco connection, because maybe there was race stuff going on on the campus, but it wasn't going on anywhere else in Eugene. So I knew nothing about poverty or the black culture or anything until this guy. And this man actually tied an environmental distraction too on Mercy, Mercy Me. Remember that? Remember these songs? Fantastic. And Holly Near came to town, and she really helped us. Her music helped connect me directly with the people on the ground in Vietnam. What was life like for them? Because I didn't watch the news much on TV. I just wasn't doing that. But through the music, I understood. Thanks to my dad, again, he provided me an opportunity to work with Lois Barton at what you call the Peace Center. I just knew it as the World Without War Council. I learned about Gandhi. I got to hang out with some elders and hear conversation about politics and social change. There was a presentation on Cole's levels of moral reasoning, and I thought, oh my gosh, we're really up against something really big to try to change hearts and minds and politics and policies in this country. And I thought, I got to go back to school and learn political science. So I did that. Because all we need is love? No, we needed a lot more than that. We needed to work for change from the inside too. So my first mainstream political work was being a precinct committee person with the Lane County Democrats in the 1974 primaries. Wayne Morse was trying to regain a Senate seat, and it was my first time going door to door, talking with people, encouraging them to be an active citizen, stay involved, that mattered. I got married for the first time on August 10th, 1974, the day after Nixon resigned. And then I moved to Portland in 1977 for the diversity, for the energy. I try to be that woman that Holly Near was singing about. I became a public education activist, working to make all schools better for all kids. Took a special interest in minority communities, particularly the Vietnamese, who came over shortly after I moved up to Portland. The boat people came into Portland. So I found a faith that works for me about 20 years ago, Unitarian Universalism. And I got into faith-based and values-based community organizing, and I'm still doing that.
We've been talking really fast. There's not a way to sum up a decade of a war in 5 minutes. I'm Marion Malcolm. I think I want to start with something pretty fundamental that I learned at some point during the war that's affected the whole rest of my life. And it's in the speech that we'll be reading on Sunday from Martin Luther King, where he talks about the war is but a symptom of a far deeper malady. And what I think a lot of us, to understand during the war is that the war was not an aberration. The war was a direct result of the role that the United States was intent upon playing in the world, and that was a role of, it's all those words that end with ISM, capitalism, imperialism, colonialism, and my government was right in the middle of that. What that meant, ironically, was I was going to be doing something like what I was doing during the Vietnam War the entire rest of my life. I didn't know then that I was going to end up doing it as a job, working for a CALC for most of my adult life, but I knew I'd be doing it at least as a volunteer. And what it said to me was that it was actually okay to take a weekend off. It was okay to go on vacation, because there was no way to sustain if you didn't do some of those things that restored you as you went along. I think that's why I haven't ever burned out, because in fact I do those kind of normal things. And I'm really glad that I had a family, that I have a family, because I think otherwise I might have been a fanatic, and I think then I would have been a bad organizer, because people would have run when they saw me coming. I think it's really important to have some of that normal stuff in our lives. Like several others, I moved here in the late summer of 1966, and like I guess a number of us in this room, we were very quickly at a protest on the occasion of the visit of Hubert Humphrey. I think he spoke at Hayward Field. He earned my everlasting dislike at that point when he referred to those of us who were very politely protesting with a few signs, and he talked about that sideshow over there. So, people have already mentioned, I think, Citizens for Sane Foreign Policy. It's a local community-based group that we formed. We did the usual array of things. Other people have talked about weekly vigils. Those were in the park blocks. Later, they were in what's now the downtown mall. In fact, I think we leafleted on the mall while they jackhammered up the street to make the mall, and then when they made it. And then by then, most of us had kids, so we were actually very glad to have a traffic-free place for our weekly vigils. Mostly I opposed the war as a woman, and from the time when my son was born in 1969, I opposed the war as a mother. And I connected, I think, on a very deep level with what I imagine the war must be like for women in Vietnam, and also for mothers of people whose sons were in the military. And so Women's International League for Peace and Freedom was, for a number of those years, the organization that I most worked with. Whoops, only 2 minutes. And we did things like raising funds for women in Vietnam, but working with the group was wonderful, and I think a couple of people have referenced this already, because we gave each other so much support. There were older women in there who supported the younger women. We traded off leadership according to who most recently had a baby. We had childcare at our meetings. Sometimes it kind of looked like La Leche League, in fact. We had so many babies in the room. And my kids grew up in the movement, and I don't think that hurt them one single bit. But one time my mother-in-law came to visit, and she said to my son, who might have been 3 or 4 at the time, that she had a little time to play with him, and what would he like to play? And he said, he would like to play demonstration. So she said, well, how do you play that? And he's marching around the living room, peace now, peace now, peace now. And I'm kind of glad that he's not saying 1, 2, 3, 4, we don't want your effing war, or ho, ho, Ho Chi Minh, NLF is bound to win. Because she had a son and 2 sons-in-law, my brothers-in-law, who took turns of being on tours of duty in Vietnam in 3 different branches of the military. And one of those brothers-in-law died many years later, but his name should be on the wall because he died ultimately from his experiences in the war. We also worked with veterans from early on. I hate it when people try to imply that the peace movement was always against veterans. And I agree with the people that have already spoken and said that it was the veterans' opposition to the war that ultimately made a huge amount of difference. One thing we did together, Women's International League for Peace and Freedom and VVAW, Vietnam Veterans Against the War, late in the war when the Saigon government was imprisoning anybody who spoke against the war in any way, shape, or form, is we went into a city council meeting and we arrested Wix Beale, who was a city councilwoman who'd been to the Paris peace talks, and we arrested Les Anderson, who was then the mayor, but because we told them ahead of time we were going to do it. In fact, we got a great anti-war statement from Les. I have to tell one more story that has Ron in it. 1 minute, 0 minutes. Big demonstration downtown. Wix Beale is supposed to speak. Les Anderson is supposed to speak. Ron Ekus is supposed to speak. He's just back from North Vietnam. I'm the moderator, 7 months pregnant. I'm the moderator of this whole rally. That's when the mall had that upper layer on it, that balcony layer. So some of Ron's buddies come up and they think the NLF flag should go up. And, Wickspiel is pacing back and forth saying, if that flag goes up, if that flag goes up, the mayor won't be able to speak if that flag goes up. So Ruth Carson and I are holding the hem of the Viet Cong flag, which I was kind of fond of myself, and negotiating. No, it can't go up now. You can put it up right before Ron speaks, but not before the mayor speaks. And so that all worked out. I wanted to talk about a lot of things.
My name is Ruth Koenig, and I too came in '66. But just had 1 year in graduate school and then began teaching. So when I think about war or the war, it is still the war to me, Vietnam. I have to look back though to the First World War and remembering that what formed me were the stories of my parents. One in the gritty Moabite area of Berlin, and one in the countryside of Poland, experiencing those horrors and sharing with me their child. Years later, it was only the bombing of the church in Birmingham that just shook everything I had ever known about decency or religion. It wasn't that I thought I could make a difference, but there was nothing within me that could understand how anything like that could happen. And so, in the summer of '64, I'd been sent information about Freedom Summer, and I went to Mississippi. So that was the turning point in my life, and I could never, ever look again at this country, at my religion, other than a very critical, in a very critical way. And Debbie's passion felt very much like mine, maybe driven by a lot of anger, feeling that I'd been lied to. You said it that way, and I think that's how I felt also. I felt that way also about my German heritage, by the way, and then had to sift through and find heroes who had risked in Germany, and heroes who had risked also in I went to Mississippi in '64. In '65, I studied cultures of Southeast Asia back at my little college in central New York, Cortland. And that changed everything about my attitude relating to Vietnam. Because people were asking me in '64, what do you think about that war? And I said, I don't know enough to have an opinion. That changed everything. And my group had Vietnam that we were supposed to concentrate on as graduate students that summer. And my part had to be the war, and I didn't want that, but that was the only one that was left because I couldn't make the meeting. And that's how I learned. And I thought, this doesn't make any sense. These people would love to join with the North Vietnamese because they've been pushed and pushed and pushed till they're almost in the sea. They need that identity. And the U.S. was doing that. That's where my understanding began, at least. So Vietnam in Eugene, I remember very well, in particular, Marion's mom, because she would call me all the time about the WILF meetings, Gene Shue, right? And I remember so well Marion and Steve and Dan. And going to all the rallies, going to the marches, being troubled by the bombings. I want to tell you a funny story because it's easier to do that and then not cry, because a lot of you have said things that have had me really close to those tears. I taught at Monroe Middle School. It was very conservative. It was hard to be there. Thankfully, a woman who is now Misa.
My name is Glenn Gordon, and I probably am the oldest person here. I just turned 90 this last month. So anybody older than that?
Well.
I'm usually the oldest person in the group, so. And the other thing is that Sue and I came with our family, 5 children at that time. Later we had 2 more, so we had 7 children in all. 5 daughters, 2 sons. We came in 1955, so we were here early on. And we've seen Eugene grow, of course, from 37,000 to 150,000 or so now. I'm a latecomer, and I really didn't become active against the Vietnam War until 1970. And if you had a child in college on that day in spring of 1970, when Nixon started bombing Cambodia, you probably received the same phone call that we did at home. Our daughter Sharon, who was at Stanford at the time, joined along with most all colleges around the country, all the students calling their parents and saying, "What are you going to do about this war in Vietnam?" That's 1970. Well, I hadn't been active against the war, but I must tell you that my mother and father were pastors in the Methodist Church in Texas, where I grew up. And my father was a very moderate, progressive person, even though we were in the South. And I was blessed because in the environment that I grew up in, I learned the values of religion. And I have been in religion all of my life, up until recently. Things have changed a bit lately, but was in the Methodist Church until 1970. And when a new minister came to the Methodist Church here after having been in 15 years, Sue and I decided, since he chose to follow the pro-government concept of continuing the war in Vietnam, we had to go to another church where there was a difference. And we went to help Norm Pott go to Central Presbyterian Church, because he was one of the main ministers in the town at that time who was speaking out against the war. Bless him. I do remember, Ron Ekus, how much I appreciated your stand in the 1968 time. That was wonderful, and I was very proud of you for doing that. But the call from Sharon was the thing that got Sue and I started, no doubt about it. We had been vacillating. I had been very busy in my life up until that time. In 1968, I was president of the Oregon Medical Association, and I had been very busy in organized medicine all those years. But by 1970, we could see that the United States was headed the wrong way. We were doing things that were absolutely terrible. I became active. Marion Malcolm helped me get started, we helped reactivate CALC, and I appreciate what Steve Deutsch did in getting it started initially. But we became a more active organization again. Norm Pott became the first president after we reactivated. And we have been going for 50 years since that time. That's wonderful. I'm very pleased with what that's done. I think the thing that I did that I appreciate the most was in 1971. I went to Vietnam. This war was still on. Didn't end until 1975. But in 1971, I got to go to Vietnam and work in Da Nang, in South Vietnam, as a doctor in the provincial hospital there. I was a surgeon. There were only 7 interns in that big hospital, provincial hospital. And they had massive amounts of trauma, amounts of injuries, amounts of people who were sick. They couldn't be taken care of because there were not enough doctors there. I did as much as I could to help. But I got to see Vietnam at the time of the war. I took over 1,500 Kodachrome pictures. I came back from Vietnam. I spoke at place after place after place, trying to help the public educate what was happening. And I agree with what Ron said too, that I believe it was the church's involvement, the fact that the communities became understandable about what was happening, that finally turned the government against the war and finally stopped in 1975. I want to recount one thing that happened while I was in Da Nang. I had an appointment with the director of the hospital at the 95th Troop Hospital across the bay in Da Nang one afternoon. We were making a tour, and during the middle of that, a siren came on, and the doctor immediately went to the emergency area. I went with him. Helicopters, Huey helicopters, were bringing in body bags right at that time from the front over in Laos, over in Cambodia, of American troops that were killed that very afternoon, brought them back to Da Nang in body bags. That was a very impressive event that I personally had experience with. I mean, there's no question that the war was bad, but it took a long time for the public to recognize it and get it stopped.
I'm Dan Goldrich. I taught politics at U of O for a long time. I'm retired. I was a very political kid, and so by teenage I knew what was going on in Vietnam. And I knew about the Geneva Accords, which the U.S. broke. I'm not going to say what I was going to say. First, I'm totally in awe of you. This group of people is marvelous. What you've said is beautiful. Your experiences so rich and so full of courage that I'm virtually speechless, but I'm going to repair to something that occurred to me last night. In 1970, I read an article which became his book, an article by the psychiatrist Robert Lifton called Home from the War. And it changed the course of my life. And I realized last night that was sort of the theme of this and of what my life became. His point about in Home from the War, he reports on working with Vietnam vets who came home needing some kind of therapy that didn't exist. And Lifton and a few associates and they created the institution of rap groups, and they dealt with their guilt. It's a beautiful book. The most important I ever read. And in it, he talks about, this is, I think, the message. If you experience evil, and if you participated in it, well, if you know about evil, and you don't act, you're going to be guilty. And you're going to feel it somehow. And there's stagnating guilt that can ruin your life. And some awful things that have happened to lots of vets. And there's animating guilt. And I know guilt had a bad name in the 70s, but I treasure it. Because what Lifton's discovered in his work is that if you can confront it, if you can bring yourself to life around that, then you can make a difference. You will make a difference first to yourself, and you may make a difference to your community. It's a beautiful book. And I think I was a very conventional social science teacher. I was liberal, progressive, but I think I was very conventional. But I had a lot of Latin American experience, which I didn't know how to use for a long time. I knew the score about empire and all that, but I didn't know how to use it. And I think my work with so many others on Vietnam changed me as a person lucky enough to be a professor. And it made me drop the horrible kind of social science work I'd done up to that point. And with a lot of help from students, from whom I learned so much, I learned environment from the students. Then I taught it for the rest of my career. But I learned it from great students. And I figured out slowly and over time how to commit to really promising social movements. And so at first, that was community controlled economic development. In the 60s and 70s, it was happening. People were experimenting with creating new institutions, community development corporations, and so on. And I worked with people in Eugene, and then particularly in the Whitaker neighborhood, to do that, to take democratic control at the community level, to work toward it. And I began to feel tremendous pleasure and gratitude in being able to work with students about these efforts and to look into it and try to retain a certain critical mind, but to commit to it as a participant and observer. And my teaching and community life became rich. I've been so lucky. And from then on to, I don't have much time. Oh, God. I'll just say the Central American movement. And I had a lot of experience in Latin America, but with Central America, I went there. And some of you went before me, and I watched you very carefully. From Sanctuary to the Central American movement, and then I went to El Salvador with Bill on probably the best experience of my life. The hard experience in that year, in those years. And then I went to Nicaragua as Witness for Peace, and then another time, and it just, I drew from the animation of Central Americans, of their confrontation with their circumstances and their commitment to a community. A lot of it was a deep Catholicism, liberation theology based. And I learned how to teach that when I came home, and the students got involved, and they would go to Central America and report back to the next class. And it had a life. And I think my Vietnam experience really moved me toward that. And working with you all moved me toward that. And working with Latin Americans moved me toward that. And that's what I thought of when I thought about today. I wrote something else out, but this is what I really feel I could say from my experience, and I think the time, and I am so awed by you. Thanks.
You were with us too, Dan.
That is a beautiful place to end, and all the lessons that are there to teach, and the awe that you've all inspired.
Crossing that as a devil's advocate to see how people think about that.
I'm in a very funny, curious position on that, because as Ellen will remember, in Chapel Hill, in the civil rights and peace movements, I was not intellectually a pacifist, quite not so. I could see a role for revolutionary violence, not then, but at some future point. We were surrounded by pacifists, including Ellen. On the other hand, thinking about times here in the 60s and 70s, when I actually would see some leftist students walking around in a crowd on the EMU terrace holding pistols, or wearing cartridge belts, sometimes with and sometimes without cartridges. No, I don't think that those were among the constructive elements among us. As I was mentioning in the break, there was one term when on my roster in one class, I had 2 students who were under indictment for entirely unrelated acts of political dynamite. Richard Oba and Roy Bennett were both on my roster, not frequently in class, but both on my roster, and I had very friendly out-of-class relations with both of them.
When you showed up.
Yeah, well, I would see them, I'd see them at the EMU and other places, if not in class. I have no trouble understanding how many people felt a positive role for I would not say revolutionary, just blam violence in the situation. Children are being napalmed. You ought to be doing something. Shouldn't you be doing something on the same scale as napalming? And then what is that if not some kind of violence? I could understand that, but I do not think that in fact it played a very constructive role.
I'm not sure which violence you're talking about.
And also the definition of violence is important.
Yeah.
One person's confrontation is another person's argument. One person's act of civil disobedience that happens to involve the destruction of property is another person's getting a focus on something that was just a physical object, as opposed to a person getting hurt or something like that. So that's important to put it in, as Jack said, put it in context. And whenever you get a large group of people that are upset about, a large group of people, you get a spectrum. You get people like Jack just mentioned. I know both those guys fairly well. They both had their issues, let's put it that way. And they both went on to lead more constructive lives in the future. But they both of them had to serve a serious amount of time for what they did.
Yeah.
And it was an era in which you could get, like I mentioned, my cousin, you could get drafted for taking one less credit hour than you were supposed to. One of my friends, they attempted to draft him because he got a B in a class. He was a pre-med. He was smart enough to get out of that. He just changed his major. And so it was a whole different world in terms of what could happen to you fairly easily. On the front lines of Chicago, My group didn't get beat up because we kept moving. The people who got beat up were the peaceful people, the people who thought they had rights. And for example, the badge shell incident, which made a lot of television footage. It started with somebody pulling a flag to half-mast. It ended with the cops coming in a flying wedge and attacking the crowd, beating up anybody in front of them. So, obviously there was a lot of violence involved in it, but the least little thing could provoke it. And you never knew what that was gonna be. It was so tense.
Ron and
Go
then
ahead.
Bill.
Well, violence was always a difficult thing for the anti-war movement, because we were against the violence of the war. But the response that you got from government, from police, often provoked people. The anger against the war often made provocateurs out of some people in the movement. And the argument with them was always a strategic one. I don't think that violence committed by the anti-war movement gave the anti-war movement any credibility. It may have been a way for people who chose to express that as a reaction to what they saw of oppression. But it always caused problems. It caused problems every time you organized something that was massive as to whether or not someone was going to provoke violence. And sometimes the provocation was not an intended provocation of violence, but at that period of time in Eugene, Oregon, and many other communities, except perhaps the South, which had already seen it in the civil rights movement, the police were not used to being confronted. They were not used to having people in the streets and not willing to leave the streets until they'd made their point. But to them, get out of the street. If you don't, I've got, and we're seeing some of this today. The most difficult question I often got asked was an assumption that we were violent and what we thought of the violence. And what I always tried to do was turn that back around, that it was not the anti-war movement that was violent. It was the anti-war movement that was trying to stop the violence of the war. There is a difference between, it doesn't justify their actions, but there is a big difference between somebody in a demonstration deciding they're going to throw a brick at a police officer and dropping cluster bombs or dropping thousands of bombs on Vietnam. And that was a distinction that I always tried to make every time I got a question about the violence. It wasn't being associated with it or justifying someone in the anti-war movement's violent actions. It was trying to turn it to recognize the enormity of the violence that was occurring in Vietnam.
I think there's a difference between violence and militance. And sometimes I think that distinction got pretty blurred. And I always thought, again, several people have said there was a spectrum, and I've always thought that spectrum was in fact useful, because if there were people over there acting pretty rowdy at best and maybe throwing a brick at worst or whatever they were doing, that made, I thought, those of us who were speaking in a well-modulated voice but making the same points easier for the officials to hear. So I never thought that it was my job to tone other anti-war activists down, and I think we wasted some energy in the movement criticizing each other's tactics that we could have better spent being against the war. Does anyone remember when the AstroTurf was brand new at Autzen Stadium and somebody defoliated a few square yards of it? Anybody remember that one? You'd have thought a terrible crime had been committed. Oh my goodness, they messed with the AstroTurf. The point, of course, was we were defoliating in Vietnam an area the size of the state of Massachusetts. And this was a few square yards of artificial grass.
I remember doing organizing a being part of. I'm not an organizer because I think I was out of the university then, but kind of planted the idea of a proper demonstration was to go to some university building and start digging holes in their lawn. And I can't remember, maybe it was ROTC headquarters or something where demonstration went, took some shovels and started digging bomb craters in the lawn of the building.
In Nebraska, we had occupied the ROTC building equivalent. It was called the Military and Naval Science Building, the same day as Kent State. And I suddenly found myself in the position, knowing that 4 people had been killed that morning, with some authority and leadership about what was going to happen next in terms of our moves with the police, and feeling like, I might have some say on whether somebody lives or dies. And it certainly changed my attitude about it, to be very conservative about violence and putting ourselves in a position where somebody could get hurt. The other thing I think...
Well, let me just say one more thing. But there really was a lot of slogans around shut it down, bring the war home. And that came out of having been against that war for a long time, and people being at a great deal of risk from getting sent over there and all of that. And yeah, I don't know whether that shortened the war. Who knows? Who knows? But the movement as a whole, including the militant parts of it, made it harder for the government to keep on doing business as usual, and that, I think, was the objective of that.
And I guess I'll just say this and see if there's any more time for more, but my question about the Vietnam vets and their impact. I think they brought the specter, not actual violence, but the specter of violence before the government. In other words, they saw them as really dangerous the same way they saw the Black Panthers as so dangerous in the civil rights movement. That they were trained, they had weapons, that sort of thing.
I never saw the vets against the war pose that kind of threat, though. I mean, in most cases, they were telling us about the experiences of the war and the horrors of the war, and they were not. The Vietnam vets against the war and the ones that were part of the organization and had joined any of the anti-war activities, they were not the ones
I agree
that
with
I
that.
saw as.
I agree with that, Ron, but that's not the point. The point is that the government didn't see it the way you and I see it.
Well, I don't know how the government saw that.
No, I think we know that.
I think what you said and what many people said is it really helped move the broader public
Yeah,
to a different
that
place.
gave it a lot more credibility.
I'd invite you to.
Is there another question?
I think we're...
I'd invite any of you to respond to each other or ask each other questions.
People have stuff written down.
Talk more than once, but nonetheless, I want to back up what Marion said in a lot of ways. It's the other side of the case I just made about showing the flag. That is, I don't think that, I think the reason that the anti-war movement basically won was that it made the country ungovernable. And that to bring that same argument about the American Revolution that I said, my friend Randy McGowan tells me the reason that the British would never have won the American Revolution, would never have won it, was that it just made Britain ungovernable. That taxes got to be so hopelessly high, and trying to send food across that huge ocean to their troops in New York, and they were not able to sustain the effort. Okay, so. Basically the American Revolution was like our Vietnam, in that we could not have sustained that war over there with all that it was costing us, plus all the social dislocation at home, and therefore eventually the other guys had to cave. And the violence or the threat of violence or whatever it may have been was, I think, a pretty essential part of that. Make the country ungovernable or you don't win.
Appy, who was here recently, made the additional point that you couldn't wage a war where you had soldiers who were no longer willing and were actually shooting each other, fragging each other. So that was also required. That made it you couldn't wage the war.
Let's have Dennis and then John.
You commented about how that transition wasn't taking place. I mean, people who were really worried, and the other thing that I think was going on that caused so much trouble was like this, the paradigm of the country. You know, like George Lakoff kind of, these deep paradigms was of the family. And one could have these disagreements within the family, but when the family was attacked, and when the family sort of interacted with, you know, the foreign policy was part of the family. And I think that is what that was one of the things that people were deeply bothered by. And really, there was no other way to really avoid that being deeply bothered, because people really weren't conscious of that. I remember in 1963, when in New York, the Progressive Labor Party used the Red Cross network of blood, and they were advertising, give blood to the Viet Cong. That was what that was their, I mean, just how outrageous was that? And but the fact is that it's damage to that paradigm that is necessary. So I tend to think that maybe the violence overall, I think, was rather minimal. I mean, when you, like I said, the Black Panthers were assassinated, okay? And that just doesn't compare to, you know, some of these symbolic blowing things up.
Jack and then Ruth?
I was gonna say.
Okay.
Who in the room, because of what you did, how you did it, the stance you took in Vietnam, was then forever after separated from your family? Or maybe it's one family member or whatever. I think maybe Debbie touched on it a bit. I don't know that I said it or how I might have said it, but it certainly was always different after that period of time. I mean, I've never sort of really totally resolved it with my family, but other people?
I had full parents. My father fought in World War II. He was on a Navy ship. Kind of always wanted me to go into the military, but not under those conditions. And he never talked about the war much because he didn't want to appear to be bragging about war. My mother didn't like the war, but you know, she wasn't one of those who was worried about my position. She was always worried about me getting arrested and having an effect on the, you know, my future. But what I did, and because, and in part this because I was fairly visible, kind of put them through hell. I mean, they took the brunt among a number of their circle of friends, their acquaintances, people they worked with. I'm sure because of my public position and the attention that I got, it affected them. But I was fortunate that it was never anything that they threw back on me. I would just hear stories later about the father of, you know, a family friend or one of my best friends telling mom she must have raised a communist, those kinds of things. And I'm sure I put them through not only just the personal difficulties of what I was going through myself and whether I was going to go to war or not. The big relief came, I'll tell a short story, when I got called up for the draft. I'd been elected student body president, started the lottery, I got into 135 or something, and I